Welcome to Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. Whether you're tuning in for the first time or you're a regular listener, I'm so glad you're here. My goal is to connect you with the visionary leaders and thinkers who are shaping our future. And today's conversation promises to be a very insightful one. Thrilled to welcome a truly remarkable guest, Jennifer Barnhill. Jennifer is an award-winning journalist and researcher and host of Military Dinner Table Conversations, a monthly reverse town hall elevating the stories of military families. She was named to the 2025 Armed Forces Insurance Navy Spouse of the Year and is a 2023 Bush Institute Stand to Veteran Leadership Scholar. Her reporting on military family policy has appeared on CNN and informed discussions on Capitol Hill, and her research has been cited by the White House, featured by NPR, and presented before Congress. Drawing on her lived experience navigating the military ecosystem, Jennifer uncovers how policies affect families in practice. Her best-selling debut book, The Military Stories You've Been Told and the Ones You Need to Hear, challenges readers to reconsider what they know about military life by listening to the often hidden voices of military families. Welcome to Tipping Spears, Jennifer.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah. Well, can you start us off by telling us where your story, begins and how you entered or how the military entered that picture?
Yes, I actually was living just outside of Washington, D.C., working at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I had graduated, just graduated college, so I was looking to utilize my degree and study in art history and journalism, editing their magazine there. And I met someone who was attending the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, and kind of threw my best laid plans out the window, as many military family members might, share that a similar experience where, you can't help who you fall in love with. And I, didn't set out to kind of, I had no military experience myself, and I hadn't had a family member be in the military. Only one friend of mine had a father who served in the Navy in the past. And so I was really unfamiliar with the lifestyle, but like I said, you can't help who you fall in love with. So my best laid plans for my career kind of put a or pin in there. And as I kind of followed him to his next duty station in Florida and then all over the world. And so that's kind of how I first, got introduced to the military community.
So I've read your writing for years. Love it. You covered topics that were just really relatable to kind of what I was experiencing as a military spouse, especially in the peak of, the global war and terror. Can you tell us what sparked, your interest in journalism and how you started down that path, covering these really hot topics for military families?
Yeah. So I graduated with a degree in art history and journalism, and so I was going to just work on editing, and kind of
Mhm.
take the safe route of using my writing to do research, academic side of things. Because at that time, I don't know if you remember it, and I'm not going to even say the date because that dates me too much. But at the time, journalism, and not to say it's not today, was a little bit more sensationalistic. There was a lot of sex scandals in the news, and it just didn't seem like I would be giving back in the way that I had
Mhm.
intended when I studied journalism. So along the way, I was always writing, while I was early in my military spouse days, but I hadn't really picked that, journalism skill set back up. Until a few years later, when we moved to Japan, and I had an opportunity to write for Stars and Stripes overseas and kind of like, again, do something that was more serving, where I was writing about the community and more positive, uplifting stories. And then, fast forward a few years, and I was taking jobs, as many military spouses do, just to pay the bills and to keep my brain sharp. But one friend of mine, a new friend out of San Diego, received a devastating cancer diagnosis, and it really struck me what was going on. Like, how are we supposed to come together as a community in support of her and her family? And we really heavily relied on something called military spouse groups, officer spouse club, enlisted spouse club, Sometimes they're called family readiness groups. Those groups were kind of looked to provide that support of meals, childcare, and that kind of day-to-day assistance that a family would provide in something similar. But we were in San Diego and it was really challenging because everyone had full-time jobs, they had children of their own, and it was just harder than it felt like it should have been. We all wanted to be there for her and we stepped up as best we could, but it really just kind of put this lingering question in the back of my brain of why is the military relying upon this unpaid group of military spouses to kind of serve in lieu of family? And we were really happy to see the command support that family. They gave time off to the service member, were very supportive. We did our best, but it just felt like there was something underlying that was kind of weak. It was a weak support structure. So I wanted to find out more. And so I started by pulling the first of, many threads I would eventually pull of what is this, reliance upon military spouses? Why is this the case? What is the history behind it? And so I wrote an article about it, which turned into writing about other things when after I had published that the editor kept asking me to keep covering more and more of these similar topics. And then it was kind of an unanticipated passion project for me where I couldn't not write about the things my friends and my peers were experiencing because, it was some way I could give back and I could serve.
Was there a particular event, or person that served as a catalyst for your career?
Whew. I mean, I would say with my career, I had a cheerleader, a friend, who taught me right in the beginning, as I was taking those jobs along the way. She was also a journalist, and not always can you operate as a journalist because you move around. And so often there are some career fields out there that, you do need to stay in one spot, earn your way, earn your, kind of credentials, and then move up from there. Or you need to be in a region that, has a lot of news, like Washington, D.C. is a very, popular place for people who are in certain fields. But we met over the years, and she said to me when I was kind of encountering that first problem that I mentioned to you before, she's like, "You're a journalist. Like, why are you just talking about this problem? You can do something about it. You don't have to just observe it or experience it as a military spouse. You have training to do the research. You know how to talk to people and ask them questions." And because I was actually embedded in the community, I was able to gain trust with people who might otherwise not have felt comfortable sharing their stories because they knew that at the end of the day, I wouldn't publish something that would put them in harm's way or make their family feel like they were being exposed in a way that wasn't putting them first. And it wasn't about the headline, it was about getting something accomplished and getting awareness out there that could end up helping that family and others.
So I know, every journey has its hurdles. What were some of the biggest obstacles that you faced in your career and how did you overcome them?
Well, I mean, I think mine is not very unusual because, as military spouses, we move every 2 to 3 years or so with our service members. So, the biggest obstacle is just restarting every time we move. As we're talking today in 2026, remote work is available, but it was not always the case. And so this is a really great opportunity for military spouses to kind of have that career longevity. But the idea of having to reinvent yourself, even if, you have a goal, like, for example, as a writer, I love to write and research. My goal was always to tell the stories of military family members because I observed that they were not in the news as much as service members and veterans because for many reasons, but that was just a passion for me. So I set the goal of doing that. I didn't know how I would do that. And so I think that for me, that was the way I found success wasn't necessarily a linear path and the linear path often affords higher pay, which doesn't always come, when you're taking that alternate route. So I think just like other military spouses, I had to kind of make my own way, and it didn't look like any there was no one to look to mirror because we all are so diverse. We live in different places at different times in our professional journeys and our personal journeys. So, I don't know that there's a formula for success, but I think that for me, the thing that has been helpful was to aim for the goal and make decisions that would help align me to that goal. And the goal was to elevate those stories.
Yeah, you're really spot on about it not being, kind of that linear trajectory. That was one thing that really got me. Married a service member. I was educated. I was accomplished. My classmates all got stellar, post-grad jobs. But I couldn't even get hired as a bank teller. I mean, I'm sitting there with grad degrees, waiting tables, tending bar. And then that was all that was available to me off some army base in the middle of nowhere. And, the resume gets crazy. It's like this, that, nothing really follows. And to your point, back in the day, I mean, remote work wasn't a thing. We just had to do what we had to do. And then trying to figure out, the way forward, at least for me, was really hard, kind of the reinvention of like, I finally got some footing, here we're moving again. All right, what it's not even like changing careers. It's like, how drastically am I going to have to morph just to, cover the bills here? And it
Mhm.
is something that's just not it's something that I feel like a lot of people just don't have an awareness around.
Yeah. Well, I think that it kind of there's things that are at play that we don't often talk about when it comes to these journeys. And one of those things is this idea that there are more transferable jobs or there are ways that are going to be more formulaic that will
Mhm.
contribute to your success. If you can't get a job, well, why don't you invest in your career? Well, then how do you measure the return on that investment, right? Like you're still behind your peers, even if you've received these advanced degrees. And only until recently, we didn't have that data to kind of support that. But unemployment numbers are roughly 20% in the military spouse community, but those numbers don't go down with increased education. So it's it's not necessarily a cure, but there's a perception that it is. And I think that that is the misalignment where, yes, we don't understand because we often are like, well, here's a solution for you. But unless we look at the data and we test that solution set, it might not actually be a solution. It might just be something for people to do. And it works sometimes. But across the board, it's not a formula for success. It works in certain circumstances. And that can make it very frustrating for military families who try to do the thing that they were told to do only to find that it didn't work for them. And that can be really hard.
You recently published a book, The Military Stories You've Been Told and the Ones You Need to Hear. Can you tell us about the book and, what inspired you to tackle writing a book?
Well, over the years, I was reporting on all sorts of things, all different types of stories. There's, the happy stories of homecomings and all of that. And then there's the harder ones of, survivors who had to battle in Congress to receive earned death benefits, right? So there's all these amazing stories of military families that, they're changing policies, they are doing all of this amazing work. And then when I'm digging deeper, I'm finding, well, wait, this isn't new. This is something that's been happening for decades, for generations, in fact. And so the reason I wanted to write a book kind of stemmed out of one particular project, but it's also in combination with the fact that our stories are valuable and I want to document them and I don't want them to be lost to history. Kind of that background where I was working at the Smithsonian. Like I know that our stories could be lost. And that was something that I didn't want for our community. But the reason it kind of became a book and why I really pushed into documenting some of these things and reporting on some of these things is I did a project in while I was working at the Bush Institute, the Veteran Leadership Project. And that project for me was looking at media representation in the military family community. So I looked at a lot of military focused news outlets and I looked at their newsletters and what the stories were in those newsletters. And I looked at who was quoted. Was it an officer? Were they enlisted? Was the story about families, about a combat situation? What was it about? and who's in there and whose stories are worth telling, right? And I found that only out of 100 and roughly 50 articles that I looked at, only six were even remotely related to family topics. So it could have been about benefits for childcare, it could have been directly about a family member, but there was only six of them. And then when I looked deeper, when officers were quoted 9 to 1 over enlisted personnel. So it really just highlights that the stories that are being told about our community are not necessarily representative of our community. And so it really made me want to address that issue, and that's a major concern. If the things the American people think that they know about our community are only based on the things that they're told, then it's very easy to kind of say, oh, that budget, that's worthwhile. Oh, that conflict, that's worthwhile. But if you don't know a person in the military or understand the lived experiences of those who serve, it's very easy to kind of just ignore this huge part of our American society. So I just wanted to document some of these untold stories to kind of add to that conversation.
In your research, what, reoccurring themes did you see in the stories, that people were sharing?
Mainly the fact that they're doing all of this. They don't, and I say this, choose an example. A family is dealing with mold in privatized military
Mhm.
housing, right? This is a common thing, and we know about that now, but we didn't always know about it. The reason we don't always know about it is because if a family encounters mold, they might tell their chain of command, they might tell the housing office to
Mhm.
receive help. And they do that, and maybe they receive help and maybe they don't. The issue became it was so widespread that it wasn't just one family with one incident in their home. Um, the community realized that this was a bigger problem than their one instance. So they were the ones who had to kind of get loud and talk to Congress.
Mhm.
They had to get loud and talk to nonprofits. They had to do that because the way that the system is set up, not every military leader has the money or the resources to fix the problem at their local installation. So there's this pattern of a family experiences something hard,
Mhm.
and because of this the institution, the way it's set up, it doesn't serve them. It's not set out to think bottom, at the bottom level. It's set to think operationally, right? It's not always the home front. The home front kind of is secondary. And so families will experience issues like mold in housing. They'll elevate the issue through the chain of command. And if they can't receive help, they will take it elsewhere and find remedy. But in doing so, it kind of like paints a negative picture of both the families who are, seen as being complaining or of the military itself, because it's not necessarily fixing the problem and it requires those families to be louder in order just to have safe housing. That's one example, but there are countless others.
Mhm. So what does it mean, to you to kind of shift the narrative about, the military family experience?
So, I think that it goes back to like whose story is worth telling, right? Like
Mhm.
the current process is, operationally focused. However, everyone in the military is a human being. They are individuals operating within an institution. And so when I think of military families, we are peripherally attached to this institution and impacted by it, right? But the book kind of takes a different tact and says that not only are we part of this institution, we are an important part of this institution that it behooves the military to take a look at and to prioritize. And in the book, it kind of goes into different examples of times when the military family has been elevated. Their stories are important and seen as important and not secondary. But it kind of ebbs and flows. Not everyone sees it the same way. Um, One of the chapters looks at this idea of military dependence, and it's a term that we use a lot. It's in paperwork, and it's on paper. It's there, kind of in terms of like a beneficiary, right? We think of insurance and who are your dependents underneath the plan that you have. But the word itself actually means to hang from and to pull from. So I
Mhm.
think of it kind of like the pictures that are hanging up on your wall, right? You have a hook in the wall, and if you don't have it properly, mounted with on a secure wall, or if the drywall isn't sturdy or something happens and you put a heavy item on it, it will pull right out of the wall and everything comes crashing down and it's not secure. Whereas the reality is military families uplift and support the home front, and they do many things to offset things like shortfalls in enlisted pay. They boost morale. They are doing these unpaid tasks that do serve the operational mission of the military. So they're really not dependents in that sense. And so it looks at how can we come at this issue? How can we look at families as important assets, people who uplift the mission, and prioritize them in a manner that supports that idea through policy and other messages that we put out.
So I know in your book, you write about kind of the invisible labor, of military spouses. What are some of the most misunderstood aspects, of the military spouse experience that, you think would surprise those who, haven't been classified as a military dependent before?
Yeah. So um, there's a lot of things that are in this community. They're kind of cultural,
Mhm.
right? It's
Mhm.
seen as um, tradition. There's a lot of traditions for active duty. There's a lot of traditions for military family members. And every community is different. So they're not all exactly the same, but there are some similarities. And um, this can be communicated to new military spouses often through books that are given.
Mhm.
When they first become a spouse, I received a pink camouflage book that
Mhm.
told me how to read a military pay stub, what to expect from a military move, things like that. But it also talked about these traditions, and some of the traditions that are applicable include the senior officer spouse role and what's expected. Whenever I talk to people who are outside of the military, I kind of liken it to the first lady. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with that role, even though it's not paid. They can make it what they want it to be, and yes, they can choose not to do it, but people still look to that role because structurally there's nothing to take its place. So you think of things like family programming. Often, when we are looking at correcting family programming and someone wants to say, hey, this is an issue, they will direct that messaging to a spouse instead of
Mhm.
to the military leader who is tasked with overseeing that program. Um, I have personally attended senior military leaders' briefings where the EFMP program brief would be directed at the spouse, not the service member. And so, here I am presenting some data on this program to people who have no control over the program at all, but to the spouses. So there's a lot of unpaid labor, or kind of who you are married to has you play a role, and it goes from senior military spouses all the way down the chain. People are bringing food to neighbors. They are babysitting. They're asked to sponsor new families who move into the neighborhood. And it's to varying degrees of obligation. But the issue is there is also this communication piece that happens, right? So it's like the idea of a phone tree. If something happens, they usually reach out to a spouse group leader to let them know, and they pass that information down. So there's a lot of layers. And one of the main things that I kind of found in the book is, is through interviews, I asked roughly, I want to say over 50 spouses specifically about their volunteering and why they volunteered for military spouse groups or anything to do with the military. And while the motivators, like why they volunteered, was very different from person to person. Someone said that they felt like, I felt pressured to do it. Someone asked me to do it. Or someone's like, I'm a serial volunteer. I would have been at the Red Cross if I wasn't doing this. So there were different motivators. But the thing that kept being true throughout was this idea that there was a need that if they didn't do it or someone else didn't do it, it wouldn't go away. Someone beneath them or in rank
Mhm.
or seniority would step up or would be expected to step up because the need was still there. And so that just highlighted to me that we have an unfunded need that isn't going away, except for the volunteerism is going away. It's harder and harder to staff those volunteer needs. So it's just
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's something I've observed, especially the past few years, when I became a military spouse. There were the senior spouses who were in the peak of the war, and they were the ones that helped me when we got a really bad, got notice of really bad things happening, and they were the ones that went to the hospital with me, and they were the ones that were there, in the months that followed. In the past few years, it's there's definitely shifts, and I think it's broader, like American culture. People are not volunteering. No, on the non-active duty side of things, I'm involved in like community government boards, nonprofit boards. I can't get anyone to volunteer for anything. And it's just so disconnected. And that was one thing I loved about the military community, was that people would step up, and I didn't have to sit in the hospital alone when my husband got, shit happened in the war. I mean, there are these people that will surround me and be there. And it's hard to like communicate that, I think, to folks who haven't experienced kind of that as part of life. But then when you're also trying to, forge a career forward as a spouse, and you're working or struggling to piece that together to supplement on income, I mean, how do you also handle, 20 plus hours a week of volunteerism that's got to be done? Because if you don't do it, no one else will. And,
Yeah.
that's just kind of the pressure. I like how you emphasize that, this is uncompensated. It's essential labor. It's needed. This needs to occur. But the model here is really not sustainable. And I think there's been a lot of shifts, especially over the past, 5, 10 years, in terms of people's availability and engagement.
Yeah. And in fact, I think last year it was announced that the last paid support
Yeah.
role it was in the Marine Corps was going away. They were the last branch to fund a position that would help with those phone trees and those
Mhm.
notifications. The social groups those are valuable for their own purposes, and if people choose to join them, that there is such immense value in that, so those social connections, to your point of like this loneliness and being alone through this experience. But there are functions that are very operational, that are tasked to some of these unpaid roles, that if you get what you pay for, right? If you have asked someone to take on the phone tree of notification during a death, I have never experienced someone telling me that that wasn't taken very seriously, and that the person who was doing that was not prioritizing that family. But God help us, like if we are not we're putting people who they then have to carry that. In my book, I interviewed someone who called herself, and I get like teary thinking of it, a death doula, that she has
Yeah.
had to sit there with
Yeah.
people through these terrible experiences, and she's doing it because now it's a friend, right? Like we are friends, but we're also serving in our own way. And I think that there's just this separation of their service and our service. Some people won't even assume that it is service, but it is those family members who stay there after in the Navy, we call it Keiko officer walks away, right? Like the families are there. They're the ones, sitting with them, helping them understand what the paperwork they just signed, like this is, how do you help until their real, like other family come in and help if they have family. So it can vary, and it's seen as social, and we're called dependas, and we have all this layer of, and certainly there are people who earn that title, of being kind of entitled in some way, but there are people who really do give up themselves in the military spouse community, who step up, who serve their country just by loving the person that they married. and then the community that they are now a part of. But there is that separation. When you call us dependa, we're not part of that family. We're not part of the unit. It's very much a separation. So I think that the book tries to highlight the role and the importance of recognizing. It doesn't mean that we need to be paid always, just recognizing the importance of the service that is provided.
Yeah, you do a really good job describing it. And I really appreciated the inclusion in the book on that. I think those contributions are often just, I mean, truly invisible and not recognized. And it really, your chapter on that just really hit home because it was like, oh yeah, this explains some of the heaviness and the exhaustion and all of that that accompanied, that part of my life. So Jennifer, my family, it was all, it was global war on terror. Those wars just kind of consumed my 20s, my 30s, and then both my spouse and I continue to work in defense now. And what I'm noticing is that many of the challenges that we faced aren't the same as the challenges kind of this new era of warfighters and their families are encountering, which some of that's good because like there's been positive policy changes, there's been positive new programs. And then some of it's not great because it means, folks have kind of dropped the ball as, people that are fighting, kind of new wars and conflicts are encountering, new things. And this is having different impacts. In your research, can you tell us what you discovered about kind of specific, service era demographics in military families and any kind of like key priorities and needs present with those, whether that's, what's going on now, GWAT, Desert Storm, Vietnam, however you want to break that down, but just kind of what you observed as you were kind of wading into this.
Yeah. I think of it from the lens of the military spouse, right?
Mhm.
So we are not on the battlefield. We are not
Mhm.
in combat. We don't necessarily understand, but we do understand some things more now, right? Like we have more access now than
Mhm.
maybe in the past. After Vietnam started televising wars, we have more
Mhm.
information about what might have been expected. And service members have additional language to discuss, what the trauma of war is. And so we all have a better shared understanding of how war impacts human beings, right? But the military spouse perspective there's a lot of similarities um, over the years. So in the book, I look at a couple historical perspectives. One of actually a few. Uh, there's stories that look at the spouses of the prisoners of war during the Vietnam era. I have worked alongside family members who served in Korea, obviously all the way through, the global war on terror. Um, One thing that I have noticed is that there is perception of, how things change over the years in our community and how things have gotten easier over the years. Um, that could be as simple of a conversation as, oh, when I was a military spouse, we would write letters back and forth, and I wouldn't
Mhm.
get communication regularly, and I didn't know what to expect. And then we fast forward to today, and there are conflict situations, and family members might be able to connect in any number of ways, right? Like they could connect via Facebook messages, which are surprisingly available when other forms of communication sometimes go out. They
Yeah.
could text, they could FaceTime, they could connect in all these different ways. Having that communication is good, but it's also hard as well. So, for example, we think about in the Navy, they turn off communications if there's an accident on a ship. And so, in an instant, the spouse knows something has happened because communication shuts down. And so, what might have gone unnoticed in the day of letter writing is now a stress that a military spouse carries with them because they know that immediate connection isn't there and they worry. So there's different hard, right? Hard is different over the years. And I wouldn't say that one is harder than the other because I think that's really challenging to compare because it isn't the case. Um, but there are similarities, right? Like we have these policies that made this aspect of life easier. But now we're at a two income society, right? So the policy that helped you get this maybe isn't even doesn't matter anymore, right? So because now something has changed, its policies don't always keep up with what's needed. So yes, things have gotten better. And I would say that's largely due to the work of military family members who have, like the mold in housing example. Families went to Congress. They shared their stories widely and gained a lot of public attention. Because of that, they had policies changed and a memo written to say there's something called the Tenant Bill of Rights that military families now have access to, that they can say, okay, look, this is my right. Now I can withhold rent until you fix this. There's a process now that there wasn't before. However, just because there's a policy does not mean that the problem is still fixed, right? So it's a matter of, is it working well? Is this still, has it helped you? Has it helped one family or all families behind? So I would say yes, there is progress being made, but the underlying idea that families still have to elevate their own problems to find a resolution is inherently the same problem because it means that we're not looking back. We're not checking in. We're not seeing, did that policy change help you? Because we're still prioritizing the operational needs above the home front needs. And so, yes, things have changed, but they've changed incrementally. And then we don't also always go back and look to see how well has that change helped improve this lifestyle.
So how can civilians, support military families that are in their community?
Just being friends with them. I mean, I think connecting with them, realizing and accepting the fact that they will leave. I think that that is a huge gift you can give a military family is to say, we know that you're not going to be here, but we think that you're worth investing in. I personally, my family, we had friends that we met in California who said that to us, and that meant the world, to know that they could have just stayed in their own group. They had their own friends. They were local to that area. They didn't have to do that. And so it was it meant a lot to our family that they did. And I think that the same would be true for other families is that, invest, but also recognize that we are liars in some ways when we say we're okay, we're fine, I say we're liars in jest, right? We don't always share what we need. And because we don't want to be seen, as weak. We want to be strong, and we don't want to put a burden on our new friends that we've just met. So sometimes we might hold it in. And so, maybe just ask again, like, are you sure? Or show up depending upon your level of comfort. Bring food, just, be there, especially if someone's deployed, you know, be there for them, check in on them. Because as we mentioned earlier, military families, we serve and we give back. So it's not a one-way, thing where you give to a military family and they're not going to give back to you. They absolutely will. They're giving almost too giving sometimes and can kind of burn out some, but they need help just as much as they give help.
Yeah, that's great advice, Jennifer. So looking forward, what gives you hope for our military community?
The fact that military families are speaking and sharing their stories and doing this work. I think that even, a few decades ago, military families wouldn't reach out to press or to Congress if they were dealing with a problem. They would be worried. And it was only within my lifetime that service members would actually be penalized if their spouses didn't volunteer. And so now we get to choose and we get to elevate the issues that we're seeing. And I would say that we do so not because we don't love the systems that we're in or the military at all. It's that we want to leave it better for the people behind us. And so when we tell our stories to the news or we tell our stories to friends or new neighbors, um, I hope that it opens the door for positive change. I hope that it opens the door for military family members to not feel so alone. I think that sometimes when we hear our stories, we see our stories online or we read our stories, it helps us feel connected to each other. It helps the average American understand what military experience is like, and especially through that lens of family, right? I don't know what it's like to be on a battlefield. I don't have any idea. I've never served, in combat or anything like that. And I think the average American hasn't either. But they do understand what it's like to worry for someone that they love and what that stress might feel like, and being alone if they're deployed. There's similarities in that experience that I think are more familiar, that offer a pathway to understanding service. So I'm encouraged that more people are telling their stories, that because of that, we're seeing positive change and understanding.
So do you have any final words of advice or parting thoughts for the audience today?
Um, just listen to more military stories. If you hear something, on the news that, doesn't really feature a human, it's more just like a person who wears a uniform, but maybe doesn't resonate because it's just, a talking point. Maybe talk to someone. What do you think about that thing that you heard today in the news? Or, I know you served. I know your spouse served. What was that like? Asking those questions, getting a little bit more insight. If you have served, be willing, or your military family member, be willing to share your experience with someone who does not understand, because I think we can kind of bridge some of those gaps. If we're comfortable, it doesn't always mean, for you sharing your story doesn't mean that you're trying to represent all military families, or you're trying to, make someone feel bad about, what you've sacrificed. No, it's just a point of connection between you and another person. So I would encourage families to tell their stories and for people to ask to listen to them.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story on the podcast today. I know your contributions to our military community have impacted so many, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of Tipping Spheres. I hope this conversation has sparked new ideas and challenged the way you think. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time with another exciting guest.